The New Testament consists of 27 books, mainly in Greek, written by various authors in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. These books are based on oral traditions, eyewitness accounts, and earlier written sources that are now lost. These were the original manuscripts, also known as autographs. What we have today are copies of copies made by scribes over the centuries, who transmitted the texts by hand. The earliest and most complete of these copies date from the 4th century AD, but there are also fragments and quotations from earlier centuries, most of which seem not to corroborate with what we have today. That's why many people are asking, has the Bible been manipulated over the years, or what? Before we get into the answer, let's quickly get acquainted with this explanation by Voddie Baucham.
If overzealous monks want to change the Bible, can I explain to you what they would have had to do? 3 levels of conspiracy. Level number 1, they would have had to have a manuscript conspiracy. When we're talking about just the New Testament itself, there are over 6,000 manuscripts or portions of manuscripts for the New Testament itself. Now, that may not sound like a lot to you, but can I compare it to a couple of things? Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. That's how we know about Julius Caesar and his conquest. We have around 10 manuscripts. Aristotle's Poetics. We have nearly 5 manuscripts. When it comes to the writings of Herodotus, we have less than 10 manuscripts. When it comes to the writings of Homer, less than 10 of each of his writings. When it comes to the New Testament, we have 6,000 manuscripts or portions of manuscripts for the New Testament. Folks, that's not even close. Well, you don't have the originals. No, we really don't. But guess what? We can get earlier than AD 120 with some of the copies that we have. When it comes to Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, the earliest thing we can put our hands on was written 900 years after the original. But nobody's tearing down the walls in college because they're reading Caesar. When it comes to Aristotle, the earliest thing we can put our hands on was written 1,400 years after the original. But when it comes to the New Testament, we can put our hands on documents that were written within decades of the originals. So if these overzealous monks wanted to doctor the Bible, what they would have to do is find over 6,000 manuscripts, change all of them, not show their ink work, get them all back where they stole them from, and never tell anybody what they did. That's just level number 1. Here's level number 2. Jesus said, go and make disciples of ta ethne, every people group. Funny thing about people groups, they tend to speak different languages. So within the first few centuries, we have the Bible translated into Syriac, Coptic, and Latin. So now these overzealous monks have to find 6,000 Greek manuscripts, change those, doctor them up, don't show your ink work, get them back. Go find all the Syriac, Coptic, and Latin translations of those Greek manuscripts, change those to match the lies that you told in another language, and get those back where you stole them from. And that's just level number 2. Now you got level number 3. The early church fathers had this terrible habit of writing commentary on the New Testament. So much so that Bruce Metzger argues, if all we had of the New Testament was the quotations and citations by the early church fathers, we could reproduce over 95% of the New Testament just from their writings. So now these overzealous monks have to find 6,000 manuscripts and portions of manuscripts, steal them, change them, don't show your ink work, get it back without anybody finding out. They got to find Syriac, Coptic, and Latin translation, change those to match the lies that they told in the 6,000 manuscripts, get those back where they stole them from, and then find all of the writings of all of the early church fathers, change those to match the lies that they told 2 layers ago, get those put back, never tell anybody what they did, and never ever get caught. Help you if you believe that.
What Voddie Baucham is saying here is that for any permutations or manipulation of the Bible to take place, there have to be at least 3 levels of conspiracies by the monks responsible for translating manuscripts or portions of the manuscripts for the New Testament itself. He says that from Julius Caesar's and his conquest, we have about 10 manuscripts. From Aristotle's Poetics, we have nearly 5 manuscripts. From the writings of Herodotus are about 10 of them. From the writings of Homer, also about 10 of each of his writings. When it comes to the New Testament, there are 6,000 manuscripts or portions of the same in the New Testament Bible alone. And that's not even close because we don't have the originals. He says we can only get earlier than AD 120 with some of the copies we have. Even when it comes to Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, the earliest we could put our hands on was written 900 years after the original. But these people are not getting uncomfortable or raising questions about how these texts have been manipulated over the years. Even Aristotle's works we have today were written 1400 years after the original manuscripts, but no one is questioning its authenticity. But when it comes to the New Testament, we can access documents that were written within decades of the original. To be more precise, the oldest and earliest manuscript witness to the New Testament is a fragment of the Gospel of John, known as Papyrus 52 or P52. It contains parts of John 18 verses 31 to 33 on the front and John 18 verses 37 to 38 on the back, written in Greek. It is dated to the first half of the 2nd century AD, based on the style of handwriting and the comparison with other manuscripts. P52 is considered a valuable witness to the early text and transmission of the New Testament, as it shows that John's Gospel was already in circulation and copied in Egypt by the early 2nd century. It also confirms the accuracy of the later and more complete manuscripts of John's Gospel, as it agrees with them in most textual variants. P52 is a remarkable example of the ancient and diverse manuscript evidence for the New Testament. So when you hear Voddie speaking like this, he sure knows his onions. So, Voddie continues that if the so-called monks were ever planning to doctor the Bible, what they'd have to do is lay hands on over 6,000 copies of the manuscripts, including P52, change all of them, erase their original texts in them, and do everything to keep these alterations concealed. And guess what? Voddie says that's just the first stage out of many. Now what this implies is that the translators would have to go through a lot of wreckage just to change one syllable of a word in the Bible. Now how does that sound in your ears? Sounds like real work, right? Voddie continues by saying the second stage of the alterations would include having to doctor tons of manuscripts in each of the languages the Bible was being translated into. And we're talking about the earliest translations in the first few centuries consisting of Syriac, Coptic, and Latin. And that is not where it even starts. They'd have to lay hands on over 6,000 of the Greek manuscripts first to be able to make corresponding changes in these other languages. Now, according to Voddie, the third stage of this hypothetical manipulation of the scriptures would be to lay hands on all the Bible commentaries written by the early church fathers. And note, writing these commentaries was a tradition in those days so much that Bruce Metzger, a professor in theology, says Bible commentaries written by the early fathers alone in the New Testament, including the quotations and citations by them, could reproduce about 95% of the New Testament just from their writings. Now, why would anyone go through such a heinous procedure just to sell an ugly lie about the Bible they didn't write? And mostly, why would anyone believe such a parody could ever be done in the first place? The position of Voddie in this is not that of denial of human error. Let's get that fact right without getting it twisted. The majority of Bible scholars have agreed that during the process of copying and transmitting the texts, no matter how prudent a process, it was not totally flawless. Scribes made mistakes, either unintentionally or intentionally. Unintentional errors include spelling, grammar, word order, and omission or addition of words or phrases. These are usually minor and do not affect the meaning of the text significantly. Intentional changes include harmonization, clarification, doctrinal alteration, and censorship. These are more problematic as they reflect the scribe's own views, beliefs, or agendas, and may distort the original message of the authors. Translators often reconstructed the original text by comparing and analyzing the existing manuscript witnesses to the New Testament. They use various methods and criteria to evaluate the textual variants and determine which ones are most likely to reflect the original wording. They also consulted external sources, such as commentaries or quotations from early church fathers like Voddie talked about, to support their textual decisions. They then produce a critical text that represents their best reconstruction of the original text based on the available evidence. Aside from these reconstructions, several other ancient texts exist that mention Jesus and/or Christianity besides the New Testament. These texts were written by non-Christian authors from different backgrounds and perspectives, so the issue of religious sentimentality is non-existent. One such is from Josephus. He was a Jewish historian who wrote about the Jewish-Roman Wars and the history of the Jews in the 1st century AD. He mentions Jesus twice in his work Antiquities of the Jews, once in a brief reference to James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, and once in a more extended passage that describes Jesus as a wise and miraculous teacher who was crucified by Pilate and whose followers believed he rose from the dead. Tacitus is another ancient writer about the existence and works of Jesus. He was another Roman historian who wrote about the history of Rome and its emperors in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. He mentions Jesus in his work Annals in the context of Nero's persecution of the Christians after the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64. He refers to Jesus as Christus, who was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, and whose followers spread a mischievous superstition that was suppressed in Judea but revived in Rome. This passage is generally accepted as authentic by scholars and is considered one of the most important references to Jesus outside the New Testament. Yet another ancient work is from Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor and letter writer who wrote about various topics and events in the early 2nd century AD. He mentions the Christians in his letters to Emperor Trajan, asking for his advice on how to deal with them in his province of Bithynia. He describes the Christians as people who worship Christ as a god, who meet before dawn to sing hymns and take oaths, and who refuse to worship the Roman gods or the emperor. He does not mention Jesus by name, but his letters provide valuable information about the practices and beliefs of the early Christians. Finally, we have Suetonius, a Roman historian who wrote about the lives of the Roman emperors and their families in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. He mentions the Christians twice in his work, The 12 Caesars, once in the life of Claudius, where he says that the emperor expelled the Jews from Rome because they were causing disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, and once in the life of Nero, where he says that the emperor punished the Christians as scapegoats for the fire of Rome, and describes them as a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. The reference to Chrestus is usually understood as a misspelling of Christus, and implies conflicts between the Jews and the Christians in Rome in the mid-1st century AD. These are some of the ancient texts that mention Jesus or Christianity besides the New Testament. But these are not all. There are others, such as the writings of Lucian, Mara bar Serapion, Celsus, and the Jewish Talmud. These texts all attest to the historical existence and impact of Jesus and his followers in the ancient world, and this we can say lends credence to the contents of the New Testament Bible. If these historical texts are faultless, as in, no one is raising questions about their authenticity, why should the Bible fall on that table? Kindly let me know your thoughts on the video in the comments section below. Don't forget to share and subscribe to my channel. See you next time.